Student vanished in 1990. Campus mystery unsolved. The autumn wind howled through the narrow streets of Halifax, carrying with it the salt-tinged breath of the Atlantic and the first whispers of winter. October 23, 1990, began like any other Tuesday at Dalhousie University, with students hurrying between classes, their backpacks heavy with textbooks, and their minds preoccupied with midterm exams. But before the day ended, it would become a date that would haunt the institution for decades to come, marking the beginning of one of Canada's most disturbing unsolved mysteries. Jennifer Hayes was 19 years old, a third-semester psychology major with auburn hair that fell in waves past her shoulders, and green eyes that seemed to notice things others missed. She had grown up in Dartmouth, just across the harbor from Halifax, in a modest two-story house where her father David worked as an electrician and her mother Margaret taught elementary school. Jennifer was their only child, born after years of trying, and they had poured all their hopes and dreams into her future. At Dalhousie, Jennifer had proven herself to be an excellent student, maintaining a grade point average above 3.7. Her professors praised her analytical mind and her ability to connect psychological theories to real-world situations. She had declared her intention to pursue graduate studies in clinical psychology, perhaps even continue to a doctoral program. Everything seemed to be unfolding exactly as it should for a bright young woman with her whole life ahead of her. Jennifer lived in Sheriff Hall, the all-female residence on campus, in a room on the third floor that she shared with Rachel Morrison, a second-year economics student from Toronto. The two young women had been paired together at the beginning of the semester, and while they were not particularly close friends, they maintained a cordial relationship built on mutual respect and an understanding of each other's need for space and quiet study time. The room itself was typical of university dormitories in the early 90s. Two narrow beds pushed against opposite walls, two desks positioned beneath tall windows that looked out over the quad, a shared closet, and institutional beige walls that both residents had attempted to brighten with posters and photographs. Jennifer's side was meticulously organized, her textbooks arranged by subject, her notes color-coded in folders. Rachel's side reflected a more chaotic personality, with clothes draped over her desk chair and papers scattered across her bed. On that Tuesday evening, Rachel later told investigators she had left the room at approximately 8 o'clock to study at the Killam Library. She needed to work on an econometrics problem set that was due the following morning, and she found the library's quiet atmosphere more conducive to concentration than the dormitory, where voices and music often filtered through the thin walls. Jennifer had been sitting at her desk when Rachel left, surrounded by open textbooks, working on an assignment for her abnormal psychology course. She seemed fine, Rachel would repeat to police officers, campus security, and eventually to reporters who descended on the university like vultures. Maybe a little tired, but it was midterm season. We were all exhausted. She said she'd probably go to bed early, that she had an 8:30 class the next morning. Rachel returned to the room at 11:25. She remembered checking her watch as she climbed the stairs, mentally calculating how many hours of sleep she could manage before her own early class. When she pushed open the door to room 314, she was surprised to find the lights still on, and Jennifer's desk exactly as it had been 3 hours earlier. Textbooks open, a half-finished essay visible on the screen of Jennifer's word processor, a cup of tea sitting beside the keyboard, the liquid inside grown cold, but Jennifer was gone. At first, Rachel assumed her roommate had simply stepped out to use the bathroom or had gone down the hall to visit another student. She changed into her pajamas, brushed her teeth, and climbed into bed with a magazine. 15 minutes passed, then 30. The overhead fluorescent light continued to hum, illuminating Jennifer's abandoned workspace. Rachel grew irritated, then concerned. She walked down the hallway, knocking on doors, asking if anyone had seen Jennifer. No one had. The residence assistant, a fourth-year student named Christine Lee, was notified at 12:15 in the morning. Christine, responsible for the entire third floor, took the report seriously enough to conduct a thorough search of the building. She checked all the common areas, the study lounges, the bathrooms, even the laundry room in the basement. She called Jennifer's name through locked doors and enlisted other students to help search. By 1 o'clock, with Jennifer still missing and no indication of where she might have gone, Christine made the decision to contact campus security. 2 officers arrived within 20 minutes, middle-aged men who had worked at the university for years and had dealt with countless reports of missing students, almost all of which resolved themselves within hours when the absent student returned from an unannounced visit to a boyfriend's apartment or an impromptu trip to a late-night diner. They went through the motions with practiced efficiency, taking down Jennifer's description, asking Rachel the standard questions about Jennifer's state of mind, whether she had mentioned any plans to leave campus, whether she had been having any problems. It was one of these officers, James Parker, who first noticed something that would become central to the mystery. Jennifer's keys were still hanging on the hook beside the door. Her wallet sat on her desk, clearly visible, containing her student ID card, her driver's license, and $43 in cash. Her winter coat hung in the closet, though the temperature outside had dropped to near freezing. Most tellingly, her running shoes were lined up neatly beside her bed, and when Officer Parker opened the closet, he saw that all of Jennifer's other shoes were accounted for as well. "So, what's she wearing on her feet?" he asked Rachel, who could only shake her head in bewilderment. Rachel tried to remember what Jennifer had been wearing earlier that evening. Jeans, definitely. A Dalhousie sweatshirt, gray with the university crest on the front, and slippers, Rachel thought. Those cheap foam slippers that all the students wore when shuffling between their rooms and the bathrooms. But a search of the room revealed Jennifer's slippers tucked under her bed, exactly where they should be. As dawn broke over Halifax on October 24th, transforming the sky from black to deep purple to pale gray, Jennifer Hayes had been missing for more than 7 hours. Campus security had expanded their search to include the entire university grounds. They checked every unlocked building, every library carrel, every laboratory. They walked the paths between buildings, shining flashlights into bushes and behind maintenance sheds. They found nothing. At 6 a.m, Campus Security Director Robert Walsh made the call he had been hoping to avoid. He contacted the Halifax Regional Police and reported a missing student under circumstances that could not be easily explained. By 7 o'clock, Detective Sarah Bennett was standing in room 314, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of the scene before her. Detective Bennett was 34 years old, a 12-year veteran of the force who had worked her way up from patrol officer to detective through a combination of intelligence, persistence, and an ability to see patterns that others missed. She had handled missing persons cases before, including 2 that had ended tragically, and she had learned to trust her instincts. Her instincts now told her that something was very wrong. "The door was unlocked when you returned?" she asked Rachel, who sat on her bed wrapped in a blanket, her face pale with exhaustion and worry. "Yes. We never locked it when one of us was inside. Only when we both left. And Jennifer's belongings are all here. Nothing missing that you can identify. Nothing. Her backpack, her books, everything. Even her cigarettes. And she never went anywhere without those." Detective Bennett made a note. She had already been told that there was no sign of struggle, no indication that anything violent had occurred in the room. The window was closed and locked from the inside. The bed was made. Everything suggested that Jennifer Hayes had simply stood up from her desk in the middle of studying and walked out of the room, leaving everything behind, including, impossibly, her shoes. By mid-morning, David and Margaret Hayes arrived on campus, having been awakened by a phone call from Detective Bennett at 7:30. Margaret's face was drawn with fear, her hands trembling as she clutched her husband's arm. David's expression was grim, his electrician's hands clenched into fists at his sides. They had driven across the bridge from Dartmouth in a daze, unable to comprehend what they were being told. Their daughter, their careful, responsible daughter, had vanished from her locked dormitory building in the middle of the night. She would never just leave, Margaret insisted to everyone who would listen. Not without telling us. Not without her wallet and keys. This isn't like her. Something has happened to her. Something terrible. The investigation expanded rapidly. Detective Bennett assembled a team of 6 officers who began the painstaking process of interviewing every student in Sheriff Hall, every student Jennifer had classes with, every professor she had studied under. They constructed a timeline of Jennifer's last known day, trying to identify any unusual occurrences, any deviations from her normal routine. Jennifer had attended 3 classes on Tuesday, October 23rd. Introduction to Statistics at 8:30 in the morning, Abnormal Psychology at 11, and Social Psychology at 2 in the afternoon. Her professors reported that she had seemed engaged and attentive, had participated in class discussions, had given no indication that anything was wrong. Between classes, she had eaten lunch at the Student Union building with 2 friends from her psychology program, Amanda Cross and Bethany Sullivan. When Detective Bennett interviewed Amanda and Bethany, both young women were visibly shaken. They had been among the first to learn of Jennifer's disappearance, and they were struggling to reconcile the friend they had laughed with over cafeteria sandwiches with the inexplicable mystery of her vanishing. "She seemed normal," Amanda said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We talked about our midterm in abnormal psych, complained about the reading load, made plans to study together next week." But Bethany remembered something else, a detail that made Detective Bennett lean forward with interest. "Actually, now that I think about it, Jennifer did seem a little distracted, like her mind was somewhere else. And when we were leaving the cafeteria, she got this strange look on her face. We asked her what was wrong, and she said something weird." "What did she say?" "She said, 'Some things are better left buried.'" We laughed it off, thought maybe she was talking about some psychological case study or something. But now, I don't know. It seemed like she meant something specific. Detective Bennett made a careful note of this statement. It was the first indication that Jennifer might have been troubled by something in the days before her disappearance. The detective began to dig deeper into Jennifer's life, looking for anything that might explain her cryptic comment. What she discovered painted a picture of a young woman who was well-liked, but somewhat private, someone who kept her inner thoughts closely guarded. Jennifer had a small circle of close friends, mostly other psychology students, and she maintained regular contact with her parents, calling them twice a week without fail. She had dated a few boys in high school, but had no current boyfriend. She didn't drink heavily or use drugs. She attended her classes faithfully and spent most evenings in her room studying. On the surface, she seemed to be exactly what she appeared, a dedicated student focused on building a future. But as Detective Bennett continued to investigate, small cracks began to appear in this picture. Several students mentioned that Jennifer had seemed nervous in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. She had been seen having an intense conversation with one of her professors in the hallway outside his office, though no one could say what the discussion had been about. She had asked Rachel unusual questions about what someone should do if they witnessed something illegal, framing it as a hypothetical scenario for a psychology paper. The professor in question was Dr. Malcolm Thornton, a 52-year-old sociologist who had been teaching at Dalhousie for nearly 20 years. Jennifer was not enrolled in any of his courses that semester, which made their hallway conversation particularly noteworthy. When Detective Bennett interviewed Dr. Thornton, she found him to be polished and articulate, with the kind of carefully constructed persona that immediately raised her suspicions. "Jennifer occasionally attended my office hours to discuss sociological aspects of psychological theories," Dr. Thornton explained, his voice smooth and measured. "She was an intellectually curious student. Our conversation that day was about the intersection of social norms and mental health diagnoses. Nothing remarkable. Did she seem upset or worried about anything? Not that I noticed. She struck me as a very level-headed young woman." Detective Bennett made a note to investigate Dr. Thornton's background more thoroughly. There was something about the man's overly casual demeanor that bothered her, a sense that he was performing rather than simply answering questions. As the investigation progressed through the following days, the mystery only deepened. Police searched Jennifer's room thoroughly, looking for diaries, letters, anything that might provide insight into her state of mind. They found course notes, psychology textbooks with passages carefully highlighted, a few letters from high school friends who had gone to other universities. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary until a detective noticed that one of Jennifer's notebooks contained pages that had been torn out, leaving only ragged edges in the spiral binding. Rachel couldn't explain the missing pages. She had never looked through Jennifer's notebooks, and had no idea what might have been written on them, or when they had been removed. The discovery fueled speculation that Jennifer had been keeping some kind of record of something she had either taken with her or destroyed before her disappearance. The university administration, meanwhile, was becoming increasingly uncomfortable with the police presence on campus and the media attention the case was generating. Dalhousie prided itself on being one of Canada's most prestigious institutions, and the disappearance of a student under such mysterious circumstances threatened to damage its carefully cultivated reputation. University President Dr. Gerald Richardson held a press conference 4 days after Jennifer's disappearance, expressing concern for the missing student and her family, while also emphasizing that there was no evidence of foul play on campus and that the university remained a safe environment for all students. Detective Bennett found the administration's attitude frustrating. When she requested access to certain university records, including information about any complaints or incidents involving Professor Thornton, She encountered unexpected resistance. University lawyers cited privacy concerns and academic freedom, suggesting that the police were overreaching in their investigation. It took a court order to compel the university to turn over the requested files, and when they finally arrived, Detective Bennett discovered something that made her blood run cold. Professor Malcolm Thornton had been the subject of 3 separate complaints from female students over the past 5 years, all alleging inappropriate behavior ranging from unwanted comments to suggestions of academic favors in exchange for personal attention. In each case, the university had conducted an internal investigation and concluded that while Dr. Thornton's behavior may have been unprofessional, it did not rise to the level of harassment or misconduct. He had received written warnings and had been required to attend sensitivity training, but he had remained on faculty, teaching his classes, and maintaining his tenured position. Armed with this information, Detective Bennett brought Professor Thornton in for a more formal interview at the police station. This time, she was more direct in her questioning, and the professor's smooth demeanor began to crack. 3 female students have accused you of inappropriate behavior, Detective Bennett stated, laying the complaints on the table between them. Did Jennifer Hayes come to you with concerns about your conduct? Dr. Thornton's face flushed. Those complaints were investigated and dismissed. I did nothing wrong. Some students misinterpret friendly mentorship as something else. It's an unfortunate hazard of working in academia. That's not what I asked. Did Jennifer Hayes confront you about your behavior with female students? No. As I told you, we discussed academic matters. That's all. Then why were you seen arguing with her in the hallway outside your office 2 weeks before she disappeared? Multiple witnesses described the conversation as heated. The professor was silent for a long moment, his eyes calculating. Finally he spoke, his voice lower now, less confident. Jennifer had developed some misguided notion that I was taking advantage of students. She had heard rumors and came to confront me about them. I explained that the complaints against me had been investigated and found to be without merit. She seemed dissatisfied with that answer, but there was nothing more I could do. I didn't see her again after that conversation. And you didn't think this was relevant information to share with police investigating her disappearance? I didn't see how it was connected. I had nothing to do with her disappearance. I was at home with my wife that entire evening. You can verify that. Detective Bennett did verify his alibi, and it held up. Dr. Thornton's wife confirmed that he had been home on the evening of October 23rd, working in his study and then watching television with her until they went to bed around 11. Neighbors corroborated seeing his car in the driveway throughout the evening. Unless he had somehow slipped out without his wife noticing, which seemed unlikely, Professor Thornton could not have been directly involved in Jennifer's disappearance. But the professor's revelation opened up a new avenue of investigation. If Jennifer had been concerned about Dr. Thornton's behavior with female students, had she been investigating the matter more thoroughly? Had she uncovered something that someone wanted to keep hidden? Detective Bennett began to look more carefully at the university's institutional structure, at who had the power to suppress complaints and protect faculty members with troubling histories. She discovered a pattern that extended far beyond Professor Thornton. Over the past decade, there had been numerous complaints of sexual harassment and misconduct at Dalhousie, involving both faculty members and students. Many of these complaints had been handled internally, with minimal consequences for the accused. The university's primary concern appeared to be protecting its reputation rather than protecting students. Several former students had left Dalhousie rather than continue fighting against an institutional culture that seemed designed to silence them. Jennifer Hayes, it seemed, had stumbled onto this dark reality. Her psychology studies had made her interested in power dynamics and institutional behavior, and her naturally analytical mind had begun to see patterns in the stories she was hearing from other students. According to Amanda and Bethany, Jennifer had started asking questions, collecting information, trying to understand the scope of the problem. She said she wanted to do something about it, Amanda told Detective Bennett during a follow-up interview. She kept saying that people needed to know, that the university couldn't just keep sweeping things under the rug. But she also seemed scared, like she knew that speaking up could have consequences. Detective Bennett now had a theory. Jennifer had been gathering evidence of systemic misconduct at the university, and someone had wanted to stop her. But who? And how had they managed to make her vanish from a locked dormitory building in the middle of the night, without anyone seeing or hearing anything? The answer to the second question came from an unexpected source. A maintenance worker named Thomas Chen, who worked the night shift in the university's physical plant, came forward 3 weeks after Jennifer's disappearance with information he had been reluctant to share. On the night of October 23rd, he had been making his rounds of the older campus buildings, checking heating systems and performing routine maintenance. At approximately 10:30, he had seen someone near Sheriff Hall who caught his attention. It was a woman, Thomas told Detective Bennett. Young, maybe a student. She was standing near the service entrance at the back of the building, the one that leads down to the maintenance tunnels. She looked nervous, kept looking around like she didn't want to be seen. Then someone opened the door from inside and she went in. I didn't think much of it at the time. Students aren't supposed to use that entrance, but they do sometimes, especially if they're locked out of the main doors after curfew. Can you describe her? She had dark hair, I think. It was dark out, and she was pretty far away, medium height, wearing light-colored clothing, maybe a sweatshirt. Could it have been Jennifer Hayes? Detective Bennett showed him Jennifer's photograph. Thomas studied it carefully. Maybe. I can't say for sure, but the timing would be right, wouldn't it? If she left her room around that time and went down to that entrance. The maintenance tunnels beneath Dalhousie University were a labyrinthine network of passages that connected many of the older buildings on campus. They housed pipes, electrical conduits, and heating ducts, and they were generally off-limits to anyone except authorized maintenance personnel. But Detective Bennett had already learned that students sometimes found ways to access the tunnels, using them as shortcuts between buildings or as private spaces for activities they didn't want observed. A search of the tunnels was organized, with police officers and campus security personnel carefully examining every passage, every storage room, every shadowy corner. What they found was evidence of regular student activity: empty beer bottles, cigarette butts, graffiti on the walls, makeshift seating areas created from old furniture. But they found no sign of Jennifer Hayes, and no indication that anything violent had occurred in the tunnels. However, the search did reveal something significant. Multiple access points to the tunnels existed throughout the campus, including several that were supposed to be locked but weren't, their security compromised by broken latches or doors that didn't close properly. Someone familiar with the tunnels could potentially enter and exit multiple buildings without being seen by the main entrance's security cameras or resident assistants. Detective Bennett obtained blueprints of the tunnel system and began mapping out possible routes Jennifer could have taken from Sheriff Hall. If she had entered the tunnels at the back service entrance, where could she have gone? The tunnels connected to the administration building, the science complex, the arts center, and several other academic buildings. They also connected to 2 parking structures and, significantly, to an older building on the edge of campus that had been used for storage since the science department had moved to a newer facility. The old science building was scheduled for renovation, and it had been largely empty for 2 years. When police officers entered it, they found dust-covered equipment, old laboratory benches, and rows of storage shelves containing decades' worth of accumulated materials. The building was cold and dark, its electricity shut off except for emergency lighting. It felt abandoned, forgotten, the kind of place where something terrible could happen without anyone knowing. They searched the building methodically, floor by floor, room by room. In the basement, in a storage room that still contained old chemical bottles and lab equipment, they found something that made Detective Bennett's heart race: a piece of gray fabric, caught on a rough edge of a metal shelf, torn as if someone had brushed against it in the darkness. The fabric matched the description of the Dalhousie sweatshirt Rachel had said Jennifer was wearing, but Jennifer herself was not there. The storage room showed no signs of struggle, no blood, no other evidence of what might have occurred. Just that single scrap of fabric, offering tantalizing proof that Jennifer had been in that place, but providing no answers about what had happened to her, or where she was now. The investigation took on a new urgency. If Jennifer had been in the old science building, who had she been meeting? Why had she gone there in the middle of the night, leaving her room without her wallet, keys, or proper shoes? Detective Bennett theorized that Jennifer had arranged to meet someone, possibly someone who had information related to her investigation of misconduct at the university. But that meeting had gone wrong somehow, and Jennifer had ended up where? Detective Bennett expanded her investigation to include everyone who had access to the maintenance tunnels and who might have known about the old science building as a potential meeting place. This included not only maintenance workers, but also faculty members who had worked in the building before it was closed, students who might have explored the tunnels, and university administrators who would have keys to all campus facilities. One name kept appearing in the detective's notes: Peter Caldwell, the university's director of campus safety and security. Caldwell had been in his position for 8 years, and he had been personally involved in handling many of the harassment complaints that had been filed against faculty members. He would have known about the complaints against Professor Thornton and others. He would have known about the university administration's policy of protecting the institution's reputation at all costs. And he would have had access to every building on campus, including keys to the maintenance tunnels and the old science building. When Detective Bennett brought Caldwell in for questioning, she found him to be defensive and evasive. He insisted that he had followed proper procedures in handling all complaints, that he had simply been doing his job according to university policy. When asked about his whereabouts on the night of October 23rd, he claimed to have been at home alone, his wife out of town visiting relatives. He had no alibi, but there was also no evidence connecting him to Jennifer's disappearance. Did Jennifer Hayes ever come to you with concerns about sexual harassment or misconduct at the university? Detective Bennett asked. Caldwell hesitated, and in that hesitation, the detective saw something that confirmed her suspicions. She may have made some informal inquiries, he finally admitted. Students sometimes come to me with questions about university policies. What specifically did she ask you? She wanted to know how complaints were handled, what happened to faculty members who were accused of inappropriate behavior. I explained the process to her and emphasized the importance of following proper channels for any formal complaints. And did she seem satisfied with that explanation? I don't know. She was a persistent young woman. She seemed to have some idealistic notion that the university should be more aggressive in disciplining faculty members based on unsubstantiated allegations. I tried to help her understand the complexities involved, the need to protect due process and academic freedom. Detective Bennett pressed him further, but Caldwell maintained his position. He had simply been doing his job, explaining university policy to an inquisitive student. He knew nothing about her disappearance, and resented the implication that he was somehow involved. The investigation was now more than a month old, and despite extensive searches, hundreds of interviews, and thousands of hours of police work, Jennifer Hayes remained missing. Her parents appeared on television, pleading for anyone with information to come forward. A reward fund was established, eventually reaching $25,000. The case received national attention, with news stories appearing in papers across Canada and even some coverage in American media outlets, but no credible leads emerged. The Halifax Regional Police brought in additional resources, including specialists in missing persons cases and criminal profilers, who analyzed every aspect of Jennifer's disappearance. The general consensus was that she had been meeting someone in the old science building, someone who had then harmed her and disposed of her body. But without a body, without witnesses, and without physical evidence beyond that single scrap of fabric, there was no way to prove what had happened or to bring anyone to justice. As autumn turned to winter, and Halifax was buried under successive snowstorms, the active phase of the investigation began to wind down. Detective Bennett remained committed to solving the case, but she had to acknowledge that without new information, there was nowhere left to look. Jennifer Hayes had vanished as completely as if she had never existed, leaving behind only questions and grief. The impact on Dalhousie University was profound. The case had exposed the institution's inadequate handling of harassment complaints and its priority of reputation over student safety. Under pressure from students, parents, and the media, the university was forced to implement significant policy changes. A new system for reporting and investigating complaints was established, with oversight from an independent board. Several administrators, including Peter Caldwell, were quietly pushed into early retirement. Professor Malcolm Thornton left the university at the end of the academic year, officially to pursue other opportunities, though everyone understood he had been forced out. But these changes came too late for Jennifer Hayes and her family. David and Margaret struggled to cope with the loss of their daughter, trapped in a terrible limbo where they could neither grieve properly nor maintain hope. Margaret took a leave of absence from teaching, unable to face her elementary school students when her own child was missing. David threw himself into his work, putting in long hours to avoid going home to their too-quiet house, where Jennifer's bedroom remained exactly as she had left it, a shrine to a life interrupted. Rachel Morrison, traumatized by her roommate's disappearance and haunted by guilt that she hadn't somehow prevented it, transferred to another university at the end of the semester. She would later tell reporters that she had never been able to shake the feeling that something terrible had happened while she was sitting peacefully in the library, oblivious, and that if she had only returned to the room earlier, she might have been able to save Jennifer, or at least provide answers about what had occurred. Years passed, then decades. The case of Jennifer Hayes' disappearance became one of those enduring mysteries that people discussed in whispers, particularly at Dalhousie, where each new generation of students learned about the girl who had vanished from Sheriff Hall and wondered what had really happened to her. Conspiracy theories proliferated. She had been killed by a professor or administrator trying to cover up institutional misconduct. She had witnessed something criminal and been eliminated by organized crime figures with connections to the university. She had been the victim of a serial killer who had never been caught. She had somehow chosen to disappear, though this theory was generally dismissed as implausible given the evidence she had left everything behind. Detective Sarah Bennett worked on the case intermittently throughout her career, never quite able to let it go. Even after she retired from the Halifax Regional Police in 2015, she continued to review the files, hoping that some new piece of information might finally unlock the mystery. She remained in contact with Jennifer's parents until David passed away in 2008 from a heart attack that his doctors said was caused partly by the prolonged stress of not knowing what had happened to his daughter. Margaret lived until 2019, dying at age 73 without ever learning the truth. In 2020, 30 years after Jennifer's disappearance, a group of investigative journalism students at Dalhousie undertook a comprehensive review of the case for a documentary project. They interviewed everyone still living who had been involved in the original investigation, including Detective Bennett, now 74 years old but still sharp. They obtained access to university records that had been sealed for decades. They explored the maintenance tunnels and the old science building, which had finally been renovated and converted into offices. What they discovered was a portrait of an institution that had prioritized its reputation and financial interests over the safety and well-being of its students, creating an environment where misconduct could flourish, and where someone who threatened to expose that misconduct could disappear without consequence. They documented the stories of dozens of women who had been harassed, assaulted, or intimidated at Dalhousie over the years, many of whom had never come forward officially because they knew the institution would not support them. Their documentary, titled The Girl Who Knew Too Much, The Jennifer Hayes Mystery, premiered at a film festival in Toronto and generated renewed interest in the case. It prompted the Halifax Regional Police to take another look at the investigation, using modern forensic techniques to re-examine the evidence that had been collected in 1990. DNA testing on the fabric fragment found in the old science building confirmed that it had come from Jennifer's sweatshirt, but it yielded no other useful information. Ground-penetrating radar was used to search areas around campus where a body might have been buried, but nothing was found. The documentary also brought forward one new witness, a former university employee named Ellen Morrison, who had worked in the administration building in 1990. Ellen revealed that she had seen something strange on the night of October 23rd, but had never reported it because she had been afraid of losing her job. She had been working late, finishing a report that was due the next morning, when she had looked out her office window and seen someone in the parking lot below, loading what appeared to be a rolled carpet or large bundle into the trunk of a dark-colored sedan. At the time, she had assumed it was maintenance workers removing old materials, but after Jennifer's disappearance, she had wondered if what she had seen might be connected. She had not come forward because she couldn't identify the person she had seen or the vehicle, and because her supervisor had made it clear that employees were expected to focus on their work and not concern themselves with matters that didn't directly involve them. Detective Bennett, watching the documentary from her retirement home, felt a familiar frustration. Ellen's testimony, if it had been provided in 1990, might have led to a different outcome. Police could have immediately begun searching for the dark sedan, could have interviewed everyone with access to university vehicles, could have examined parking lot security footage before it was erased. But 30 years later, the lead was useless, just another tantalizing hint of what might have happened without any way to follow up. The truth, Detective Bennett had come to believe, was that Jennifer Hayes had been murdered by someone connected to Dalhousie University, someone who had the knowledge, access, and motivation to make her disappear. That person had likely moved her body off campus shortly after killing her, disposing of it in a way that ensured it would never be found. The killer might have died themselves by now, taking their secret to the grave, or they might still be alive, living an ordinary life while carrying the knowledge of what they had done. Halifax Regional Police officially listed Jennifer Hayes' case as a cold case, still open, but with no active investigation. Her file sat in storage along with thousands of others, waiting for the unlikely event that new information would emerge. In the meantime, Her story served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of institutional cover-ups and the importance of believing and protecting those who speak up about wrongdoing. On October 23rd of each year, a small memorial service is held at Dalhousie University, organized by the student union and attended by those who remember Jennifer's case. A plaque was installed in 2010 outside Sheriff Hall, reading, "In memory of Jennifer Hayes, 1971-1990, a voice for justice, never forgotten." Students passing by the plaque often pause to read it, learning for the first time about the young woman who disappeared from her dorm room and was never seen again. The mystery remains unsolved, a dark chapter in the history of an institution that has worked hard to move past its troubled history but can never quite escape it. Sometimes, students in Sheriff Hall report strange occurrences on the third floor, doors opening and closing on their own, the sound of footsteps in empty hallways, a feeling of being watched. Whether these are genuine paranormal phenomena or simply the power of suggestion fueled by knowledge of what happened there, they serve as a reminder that some mysteries refuse to be buried, that some voices demand to be heard even after they have been silenced. Jennifer Hayes' case stands as a testament to the consequences of institutional corruption and the vulnerability of individuals who dare to challenge powerful systems. Her disappearance exposed deep problems at Dalhousie University and led to meaningful reforms, but those changes came too late for her and for the other victims whose suffering had been ignored or minimized for years. More than 3 decades later, the questions remain. What exactly did Jennifer discover in her investigation of misconduct at the university? Who did she plan to meet in the old science building that October night? What happened in those dark corridors that caused her to vanish so completely? And where is she now? These questions may never be answered, but as long as people continue to ask them, as long as Jennifer's story continues to be told, her voice has not been entirely silenced. She became in death what she was trying to be in life, a catalyst for change, a reminder that institutions must be held accountable, and that every student deserves to be safe and protected. The case of Jennifer Hayes remains one of Canada's most haunting unsolved mysteries, a story of a bright young woman whose pursuit of justice may have cost her everything. Her disappearance from a locked dormitory room, leaving behind all her possessions as if she had simply stepped out for a moment, continues to baffle investigators and capture public imagination. The truth of what happened that night in 1990 remains hidden, buried beneath layers of institutional secrecy, lost evidence, and the passage of time. But somewhere, someone knows what happened to Jennifer Hayes. Someone knows where she is. And until that person comes forward, or that secret is uncovered, her case will remain open, her memory will endure, and the mystery will persist. A shadow over the halls of Dalhousie University, and a reminder of the darkness that can lurk behind even the most prestigious facades. The autumn wind still howls through the streets of Halifax, carrying echoes of that October night when a 19-year-old psychology student walked out of her dorm room and into oblivion. And in room 314 of Sheriff Hall, now occupied by a new generation of students who know nothing of what occurred there, the desk where Jennifer Hayes left her textbooks open and her essay unfinished stands as a silent witness to a mystery that has never been solved, a disappearance that defies explanation, and a tragedy that continues to resonate more than 30 years later. In the years following the 2020 documentary, the case of Jennifer Hayes experienced what Detective Bennett referred to as a slow burn renaissance. New witnesses continued to come forward, people who had been too frightened or too young at the time to speak up, but who now felt compelled to share what they knew. Each new piece of information added another layer to the mystery without necessarily bringing investigators any closer to solving it. One of the most significant new witnesses was a man named Gregory Walsh, who had been a graduate student in the chemistry department at Dalhousie in 1990. Gregory had been working late in one of the laboratories on the night of October 23rd, conducting experiments for his thesis research. He had left the building around 11 o'clock, taking his usual route across campus toward the parking lot where his car was waiting. As he walked past the old science building, he had noticed something unusual, a light moving inside, visible through one of the basement windows, like someone carrying a flashlight through the darkened building. I remember thinking it was strange because I knew that building was supposed to be empty, Gregory told investigators in 2021, but I assumed it was maintenance or security doing rounds. I didn't think much of it at the time. It was only later, after Jennifer disappeared and police found that piece of her sweatshirt in the building, that I started to wonder if what I'd seen was connected. Gregory's testimony placed someone in the old science building at almost exactly the time Jennifer would have been there, based on Thomas Chen's sighting of a young woman entering the maintenance tunnels around 10:30. But 30 years later, there was no way to determine who that person had been or what they had been doing in the abandoned building. Another witness who came forward was Patricia Drummond, who had been a secretary in the sociology department in 1990. Patricia revealed that Professor Malcolm Thornton had asked her to shred a large quantity of personal files in the days immediately following Jennifer's disappearance. At the time, she had thought it was odd timing, but had not questioned it, as professors occasionally cleaned out their filing cabinets and disposed of old materials. In retrospect, however, she wondered if those files might have contained information relevant to the investigation. "He was very specific about it," Patricia recalled. "He stood there and watched me feed every page into the shredder. He didn't just hand me a box and walk away like professors usually did. He wanted to make sure nothing survived. I remember his hands were shaking slightly, and he kept checking his watch, like he was anxious to get it done quickly." Detective Bennett, now consulting on the case from retirement, found this information frustrating, but not surprising. Professor Thornton had died in 2007 from complications of diabetes, taking whatever secrets he might have known to his grave. Without the files Patricia had shredded, there was no way to know what information they had contained or whether they had any connection to Jennifer's disappearance. The renewed attention to the case also prompted the Halifax Regional Police to conduct a comprehensive review of all physical evidence that had been collected in 1990. Modern forensic techniques had advanced significantly in the intervening decades, and investigators hoped that DNA testing, trace evidence analysis, or other scientific methods might reveal information that had been impossible to obtain with 1990s technology. The review was led by Detective Marcus Sullivan, a 38-year-old investigator who had joined the force in 2005 and had made a name for himself by solving several cold cases using innovative forensic approaches. Sullivan was methodical and thorough, qualities that had served him well in his career. He approached the Jennifer Hayes case with fresh eyes, unencumbered by the assumptions and theories that had guided the original investigation. Sullivan started by cataloging every piece of physical evidence: the scrap of fabric from Jennifer's sweatshirt, photographs of her dormitory room taken on the night she disappeared, fingerprints lifted from various surfaces, hair and fiber samples collected from the old science building. Each item was carefully logged and then sent to the Provincial Forensics Laboratory for analysis using current technology. The results were both enlightening and disappointing. DNA testing on the fabric fragment confirmed what was already known. It had come from Jennifer's sweatshirt and had been torn sometime around the date of her disappearance. However, no other DNA was found on the fabric, suggesting that if someone had grabbed Jennifer or struggled with her, they had not left biological evidence on her clothing, or that evidence had degraded beyond recovery in the 30 years the fabric had been in storage. Fingerprints from the old science building were compared against national databases that had not existed in 1990, but most of the prints were too degraded or incomplete to provide useful matches. A few were identified as belonging to maintenance workers who had worked at the university, but all of these individuals had been interviewed during the original investigation and had provided alibis for the night in question. Hair samples found in Jennifer's dormitory room were subjected to mitochondrial DNA analysis, a technique that could sometimes provide information about maternal lineage, even when traditional DNA testing failed. The analysis revealed that most of the hair belonged to Jennifer herself, with a few strands matching Rachel Morrison, which was expected given that they shared the room. However, several strands could not be matched to either young woman, suggesting they had come from visitors to the room, or perhaps from previous occupants of the dormitory. One strand of hair in particular drew Detective Sullivan's attention. It was longer than the others, approximately 12 inches in length, and appeared to be from a male based on its coarseness and the presence of beard hair characteristics. The DNA extracted from this hair revealed that it belonged to someone with Northern European ancestry, but there was no match in any criminal database. Without a suspect to compare it to, the hair was simply another data point. Interesting, but ultimately not actionable. Sullivan also reviewed all the interviews that had been conducted in 1990, reading through thousands of pages of transcripts and notes. He was looking for inconsistencies, statements that didn't quite add up, people whose stories had changed, or who had seemed evasive in their responses. Several names kept appearing in the files, individuals who had known Jennifer, or had been in positions to know something about her disappearance, but whose involvement had never been fully explored. One of these individuals was Brandon Mitchell, who had been a senior at Dalhousie in 1990, studying political science with plans to attend law school. Brandon had been president of the student council and was well known on campus as an ambitious, charismatic student leader. He had been interviewed briefly during the original investigation because he had known Jennifer casually through various campus activities, but he had provided a solid alibi for the night of October 23rd. He had been at a student council meeting that ran until 10 o'clock, and then had gone directly home to the apartment he shared with 2 roommates, arriving by 10:30. His roommates had confirmed his presence for the rest of the evening. What caught Detective Sullivan's attention, however, was a note in the margin of Brandon's interview transcript, written by one of the detectives who had conducted the interview. The note read, "Too smooth. Rehearsed answers?" It was a small thing, easily overlooked, but it suggested that the original investigator had sensed something off about Brandon's demeanor, even if there was no concrete reason to suspect him. Sullivan decided to track down Brandon Mitchell, who was now Brandon Mitchell Harrington, a prominent lawyer in Ottawa with a successful practice specializing in corporate law. When Sullivan contacted him to request a follow-up interview, Brandon was cordial but firm. He would be happy to answer any questions the detective had, but he would not do so without his own lawyer present, and he would need several weeks to arrange his schedule to accommodate the interview. This response struck Sullivan as odd. Brandon had not been considered a suspect in 1990, and there was no reason for him to lawyer up unless he had something to hide. Of course, as an attorney himself, Brandon would be naturally cautious about speaking to police without representation, but the delay tactics suggested a level of concern that seemed disproportionate to the situation. While waiting for Brandon to make himself available, Sullivan continued to dig into his background. He discovered that Brandon had been involved in several controversies during his time at Dalhousie, including allegations that he had misappropriated student council funds for personal use, and claims that he had sexually assaulted a female student at a party. Though no formal charges had ever been filed in either case, the university had handled both matters internally, and Brandon had been able to continue his studies and graduate with honors. Sullivan also learned that Brandon had been close to several administrators in the university, including Peter Caldwell, the former director of campus safety, who had been pushed into early retirement after Jennifer's disappearance. According to several former students who were interviewed, Brandon and Caldwell had been seen together frequently, sometimes meeting off campus at a local bar, where they would sit in a back booth engaged in quiet conversations that seemed more serious than simple mentor-student chats. The connection between Brandon and Peter Caldwell opened up a new avenue of investigation. Caldwell, who was now 78 years old and living in a retirement community in Lunenburg, had always been a person of interest in Jennifer's disappearance, though there had never been enough evidence to charge him with anything. If Caldwell and Brandon had been working together in some capacity, if they had both been involved in covering up misconduct at the university, then perhaps they had both had reasons to want Jennifer to disappear. Detective Sullivan drove to Lunenburg on a cold morning in February 2022, the roads slick with ice, and the sky a uniform gray that promised snow. The retirement community where Peter Caldwell lived was a sprawling complex of low buildings arranged around a central courtyard. Sullivan found Caldwell in his apartment, a small but comfortable unit with large windows overlooking a frozen pond. Peter Caldwell had aged considerably since Detective Bennett had last interviewed him in 1990. He walked with a cane now, and his once commanding presence had diminished into the frailty of advanced age, but his mind remained sharp, and his eyes were alert as he invited Sullivan inside and offered him coffee. "I've been wondering when someone would come talk to me again," Caldwell said, settling into a worn armchair. That documentary stirred up a lot of old memories, a lot of old guilt, too, if I'm being honest. Sullivan sat across from him, notebook in hand. "What do you have to feel guilty about, mister?" "Caldwell?" The old man was silent for a long moment, staring out the window at the frozen landscape. When he spoke, his voice was heavy with regret. "I knew things were wrong at Dalhousie. I knew that professors were taking advantage of students, that complaints were being buried to protect the university's reputation. I was part of that system. I did what I was told to do by people above me in the administration, and I told myself I was just following orders, just doing my job. But that's no excuse, is it? I could have stood up. I could have insisted that things be handled properly. I didn't, and maybe that's why Jennifer Hayes ended up dead. You think she was killed because she was investigating misconduct at the university? Don't you? What else makes sense? That girl was smart and determined. She had started asking questions, collecting information from other students, and she wasn't going to let it go. Someone decided she was too dangerous to leave alone. Who? Mr. Caldwell? Who made that decision? The old man shook his head slowly. I don't know for certain. I've spent 30 years thinking about it, trying to figure out who had the most to lose if Jennifer exposed what was happening. There were several professors whose careers would have been destroyed. There were administrators who would have been fired. There were wealthy donors who didn't want their alma mater's reputation tarnished. Any of them could have been involved. Sullivan leaned forward. What about Brandon Mitchell? What was your relationship with him? Caldwell's expression tightened. Brandon was a student leader. I worked with him on various campus safety initiatives. Why do you ask? Because several witnesses have said you and Brandon had a relationship that went beyond normal student-administrator interactions. That you met privately, off campus, and had conversations that seemed secretive. Brandon was ambitious. He wanted to go into politics eventually, and he knew that connections were important. He cultivated relationships with people who could help him advance his career. That's all it was. Did Brandon know about the complaints against Professor Thornton and other faculty members? Caldwell hesitated, and in that hesitation, Sullivan saw the truth. He knew, Caldwell finally admitted. He was student council president. He had access to information that other students didn't have. And yes, we discussed it. He was concerned about how it would affect the university's reputation if the information became public. Concerned enough to do something about it? I don't know what you're implying, Detective, but I never saw or heard anything that would suggest Brandon was involved in Jennifer's disappearance. He had an alibi, didn't he? He was at a meeting and then went home to his apartment. Alibis can be fabricated, Mr. Caldwell, especially when the people providing them have something to gain from protecting each other. The old man's face hardened. I think I've said everything I have to say. If you have further questions, you'll need to speak to my lawyer. Sullivan left Lunenburg with more questions than answers, but he had confirmation of something important. Brandon Mitchell had known about the misconduct at Dalhousie and had been concerned about it becoming public. That gave him a motive, even if the evidence linking him directly to Jennifer's disappearance remained circumstantial. The detective's next step was to track down Brandon's former roommates from 1990, the two young men who had provided his alibi. One of them, Christopher Park, had moved to Vancouver and was now a software engineer. The other, Sean O'Brien, had stayed in Nova Scotia and worked as a high school teacher in Truro. Sullivan interviewed both men, starting with Sean. Sean O'Brien was 48 years old now, with graying hair and the slightly harried look of someone who spent his days managing classrooms full of teenagers. When Sullivan called to request an interview, Sean agreed immediately, saying that he had actually been thinking about the Jennifer Hayes case ever since the documentary had aired, and that there was something he needed to tell someone. They met at a coffee shop in Truro, sitting in a corner booth away from other customers. Sean wrapped his hands around his coffee mug and took a deep breath before speaking. I lied in 1990, he said simply. Not a big lie, but a lie nonetheless. Brandon asked me to, and I went along with it because he was my friend and I didn't think it mattered. But it's bothered me ever since, especially after I learned what happened to that girl. Sullivan felt his pulse quicken. What did you lie about? Brandon wasn't home when I said he was. The student council meeting did end around 10, but he didn't come straight home. Chris and I were watching TV, and Brandon didn't get back to the apartment until after midnight. When the police came to interview us a few days later, Brandon pulled us aside first and asked us to say he'd been home by 10:30. He said it would look bad if he couldn't account for his time, even though he hadn't done anything wrong. He said the police would waste time investigating him instead of finding out what really happened to Jennifer. And you just went along with that? Sean looked miserable. We were 21 years old and Brandon was our friend. He was also kind of intimidating, you know. Very charismatic. Very persuasive. He made it seem like it was no big deal. Like we were actually helping the investigation by giving him an alibi so the police could focus on real suspects. And honestly, I didn't think Brandon had anything to do with it. He didn't seem like someone who would hurt anyone. Did Brandon ever tell you where he actually was that night? Between 10 and midnight? No. He said it was better if we didn't know. That way we couldn't accidentally say something wrong. He just kept insisting that he wasn't involved in Jennifer's disappearance and that his whereabouts weren't important. Sullivan thanked Sean for his honesty and then contacted Christopher Park in Vancouver. Christopher's story matched Sean's almost exactly. Brandon had not been home when they had told police he was, and he had convinced them to lie on his behalf. Christopher added one additional detail. He had noticed that when Brandon finally did come home that night, his clothes were dirty, like he had been somewhere dusty or muddy, and he had seemed agitated and distracted. With this new information, Detective Sullivan now had grounds to treat Brandon Mitchell Harrington as a legitimate suspect in Jennifer Hayes' disappearance. Brandon's alibi was false. He had a motive related to protecting the university's reputation and his own political ambitions, and he had access to campus buildings through his position as student council president. The pieces were starting to come together. Sullivan obtained a warrant to access Brandon's university records from 1990, including his schedule, his campus access records, and any disciplinary files that might exist. What he found was revealing. Brandon had checked out a master key from campus security on October 22nd, the day before Jennifer disappeared, citing a need to access various campus buildings for student council business. The key had been returned on October 25th, 2 days after Jennifer's disappearance. This meant Brandon had the ability to enter virtually any building on campus, including the old science building and the maintenance tunnels, during the critical time period. Furthermore, Sullivan discovered that Brandon had been listed as a person of interest in the sexual assault allegation that had been filed against him, though the case had been dropped when the complainant, a first-year student named Jessica Turner, had suddenly withdrawn her allegation and transferred to another university. Reading through the file, Sullivan saw clear signs that Jessica had been pressured to drop the complaint, though the nature of that pressure was not documented. The detective tracked down Jessica Turner, now Jessica Turner Walsh, living in Montreal with her husband and 2 children. When he called to request an interview, Jessica's initial response was hesitant, but when Sullivan explained that the case might be connected to Jennifer Hayes' disappearance, she agreed to speak with him. They met at a restaurant in Montreal on a rainy afternoon in March. Jessica was 48 years old, professionally dressed, with the guarded demeanor of someone who had learned not to trust easily. She listened as Sullivan explained the investigation, and when he asked about Brandon Mitchell, her expression darkened. "That man destroyed my life," she said quietly. "Or at least, he destroyed the life I thought I was going to have. I went to Dalhousie with dreams of becoming a lawyer, of making a difference in the world. Brandon took that from me. Can you tell me what happened?" Jessica took a deep breath. "I met Brandon at a student council event in September of 1990. He was charming, attentive, made me feel special. He invited me to a party at his apartment, said it would be a good way to meet people. I went, and he made sure my drinks were constantly refilled. I don't remember everything that happened that night, but I woke up in his bedroom the next morning with my clothes half off, and no memory of how I got there. Brandon was there, acting like everything was normal, like we had consensually hooked up, but I knew something was wrong. I felt violated. You reported it to campus security." "I did. I filed a formal complaint, thinking the university would take it seriously. Instead, I was called into meetings with administrators who questioned everything about my story. How much had I had to drink? What was I wearing? Had I led Brandon on? It felt like I was the one on trial. And then Peter Caldwell came to see me in my dorm room one night. He told me that pursuing the complaint would be difficult, that Brandon was well-connected and had resources to fight back, and that the whole process would be traumatic for me. He strongly suggested that I withdraw the complaint and transfer to another school where I could make a fresh start. He pressured you to drop the complaint?" "Absolutely. And not just him. Brandon sent me letters, not threatening exactly, but reminding me that accusations of sexual assault could ruin someone's life and that I needed to be very sure of my facts before proceeding. His father, who was a lawyer in Toronto, had his firm send me a letter warning me about the consequences of making false allegations. I was 18 years old, scared, and completely overwhelmed. So I dropped the complaint and transferred to McGill at the end of the semester. I never went back to Dalhousie." "Did you know Jennifer Hayes?" Jessica shook her head. "Not personally, but I heard about her disappearance before I left Dalhousie. Everyone was talking about it. And I remember thinking that if she had been investigating misconduct at the university, she would have eventually found out about what happened to me and to other girls. There were rumors about several professors and about students like Brandon who seemed to operate with impunity. Maybe she got too close to the truth." Sullivan left Montreal with a clearer picture of who Brandon Mitchell had been in 1990, a predator protected by institutional corruption, someone who had the motivation and the means to eliminate a threat to his future. But proving that he had killed Jennifer Hayes 3 decades ago would require more than testimony and circumstantial evidence. It would require something concrete, some piece of physical evidence that definitively linked Brandon to the crime. The detective's next move was to request a court order compelling Brandon to provide a DNA sample. The strand of unidentified hair found in Jennifer's dormitory room might belong to Brandon, and if it did, It would place him in her room at some point, which was something he had never mentioned in his original interview. Brandon's lawyer fought the request vigorously, arguing that there was no probable cause to compel his client to provide DNA after 3 decades, but the court sided with the police, ruling that the investigation into a missing person case justified the intrusion. Brandon provided the DNA sample under protest, and it was sent to the laboratory for comparison with the unidentified hair. The results came back 6 weeks later. It was not a match. The hair in Jennifer's room had come from someone else, someone who remained unidentified. This was a significant setback, but Sullivan was not ready to give up on Brandon as a suspect. He continued to investigate, looking for other connections, other evidence that might have been missed in the original investigation. He re-interviewed Rachel Morrison, Jennifer's former roommate, who was now Rachel Morrison Chen, living in Victoria, British Columbia, with her husband and 3 teenage children. Rachel had spent 30 years trying to move past the trauma of Jennifer's disappearance, but the memories were still vivid when Sullivan called her. She agreed to speak with him via video conference, and as they talked, she remembered details that she hadn't thought about in years. "There was something Jennifer said to me about a week before she disappeared," Rachel recalled, her brow furrowed in concentration. She had been on her computer doing research for a paper, and she suddenly closed all her windows and looked really upset. I asked her what was wrong, and she said something like, "Some people are so good at hiding who they really are." I asked her what she meant, but she wouldn't elaborate. She just said she had learned something disturbing and needed to think about what to do with the information. "Did she give you any hint about what she had learned or who she was talking about?" "Not directly, but I got the impression it was about someone at the university, someone in a position of authority or respect. She seemed almost betrayed, like she had discovered that someone she trusted wasn't who she thought they were." This statement suggested that Jennifer might have uncovered information about someone she knew personally, not just abstract evidence of institutional misconduct. Sullivan made a list of everyone in Jennifer's life who held positions of authority or trust: her professors, campus security staff, resident advisors, student council members, university administrators. Brandon Mitchell fit the profile, but so did several others. One name that kept appearing in the files but had never been thoroughly investigated was Dr. Helena Winters, Jennifer's academic advisor and a professor in the psychology department. Dr. Winters had been 43 years old in 1990, a respected researcher specializing in abnormal psychology and trauma. She had supervised Jennifer's course selection and had met with her regularly to discuss her academic progress. According to several students who were interviewed, Dr. Winters had taken a particular interest in Jennifer, mentoring her and encouraging her to pursue graduate studies. Sullivan decided to investigate Dr. Winters more thoroughly, though she had passed away in 2015 from ovarian cancer, making a direct interview impossible. He obtained her personnel file from Dalhousie and discovered something that had never been followed up on in the original investigation. Dr. Winters had taken a sudden leave of absence from the university in November 1990, just 3 weeks after Jennifer's disappearance, citing personal health issues. She had remained on leave for the entire spring semester, returning to teaching only in September 1991. This timing struck Sullivan as significant. Had Dr. Winters' leave been genuinely related to health problems, or had it been connected to Jennifer's disappearance? The detective contacted Dr. Winters' surviving family members, including her adult daughter, Sarah Winters McLeod, who lived in Toronto. Sarah agreed to meet with Sullivan, though she insisted she knew nothing about Jennifer Hayes or her mother's involvement in the case. They met at Sarah's home, a modern townhouse in a quiet neighborhood. Sarah, now in her early 50s, bore a strong resemblance to her late mother, with the same intelligent eyes and cautious demeanor. "My mother was devastated by what happened to Jennifer," Sarah told Sullivan. "She felt responsible somehow, even though she had nothing to do with it. Jennifer had been one of her favorite students, someone she saw great potential in. When Jennifer disappeared, my mother blamed herself for not noticing that something was wrong, for not protecting her somehow. Is that why she took a leave of absence? Partly. She also had some health issues that needed attention. But yes, Jennifer's disappearance affected her deeply. She became obsessed with the case, reading every news article, following every development. She even hired a private investigator at one point, using her own money to try to find out what had happened. This was new information." Sullivan leaned forward with interest. "A private investigator? Do you know who it was or what they found?" "I don't remember the investigator's name, but I know my mother was disappointed with the results. The investigator looked into various theories but couldn't find any concrete evidence. My mother kept the investigator's reports, though. They might still be in her papers. I have boxes of her things in my basement that I haven't gone through yet. Sullivan asked if he could examine those papers, and Sarah agreed. They went down to the basement, where several large boxes were stacked against the wall, labeled Helena's files. They spent the next 2 hours going through the contents: academic papers, correspondence, personal notes, and finally, a manila folder labeled Jennifer Hayes Investigation. Inside the folder were reports from a private investigator named Robert Mackenzie, dated from late 1991 through early 1992. Mackenzie had conducted extensive interviews with students, faculty, and staff at Dalhousie, focusing on Jennifer's final weeks and the various people she had interacted with. His reports were detailed and professional, and they revealed several leads that the police had apparently not pursued. One report in particular caught Sullivan's attention. Mackenzie had interviewed a graduate student named Thomas Riley, who had worked as a teaching assistant in the psychology department. Thomas had told the investigator that he had seen Jennifer in the university library on the evening of October 22nd, the night before her disappearance. She had been sitting at a computer terminal in the reference section, and Thomas had noticed her because she seemed distressed. When he approached to ask if she was okay, Jennifer had quickly closed the windows on her computer screen and told him she was fine, just stressed about midterms. But Thomas had glimpsed what was on the screen before she closed it. It appeared to be a document or file with a list of names, possibly from some kind of database or record system. This was significant because it suggested that Jennifer had accessed information on a university computer, possibly confidential records that she wasn't supposed to see. If she had been investigating misconduct and had managed to access personnel files or disciplinary records, that would explain why she might have seemed upset and why someone might have wanted to stop her from revealing what she had found. Sullivan obtained another court order, this time requesting access to archived computer records from Dalhousie's library system in October 1990. The university's IT department was initially skeptical that such records would still exist after 30 years, but a thorough search of backup systems revealed that some login data had been preserved. The records showed that Jennifer Hayes had logged into a library computer on October 22nd at 7:43 p.m. and had remained logged in until 9:17 p.m. During that time, she had accessed several databases, including the university's internal personnel directory and a restricted system that contained student disciplinary records. How Jennifer had gained access to restricted systems was unclear, but Sullivan theorized that she might have obtained login credentials from someone who had authorized access, possibly a sympathetic staff member or student worker. What mattered was that the computer records proved Jennifer had been researching something in the days before her disappearance, and whatever she had found had likely contributed to her fate. The detective now had a clearer timeline of events. Jennifer had accessed confidential university records on October 22nd, discovering information that disturbed her. The next day, October 23rd, she had attended her classes normally, but had seemed distracted and had made the cryptic comment to her friends about some things being better left buried. That evening, she had left her dormitory room between 10 and 10:30 p.m., entering the maintenance tunnels and making her way to the old science building, where she had apparently been meeting someone. Something had gone wrong during that meeting, and Jennifer had disappeared, leaving behind only a scrap of her sweatshirt and a mystery that had haunted Halifax for 3 decades. But who had she been meeting, and what had they done to her? Sullivan returned to the most likely suspect, Brandon Mitchell. Brandon had a false alibi, a history of predatory behavior, access to campus buildings through the master key he had checked out, and a strong motivation to protect himself and the university from exposure. But without physical evidence placing him at the scene, without a witness who could testify to seeing him with Jennifer that night, Sullivan had no way to charge him with a crime. The detective decided to try a different approach. He arranged for a face-to-face interview with Brandon Mitchell Harrington in Ottawa, with Brandon's lawyer present. The meeting took place in a conference room at Brandon's law firm, a sleek office tower in the downtown core. Brandon looked every inch the successful attorney. Expensive suit, confident bearing, a polished professionalism that had been honed over 3 decades of practice. Sullivan began the interview by walking through the timeline of October 23, 1990, asking Brandon to account for his whereabouts hour by hour. Brandon, following his lawyer's advice, provided careful, measured answers, acknowledging that his memory of specific details after 30 years was imperfect, but insisting that he had nothing to do with Jennifer's disappearance. Then Sullivan played his card. "Your alibi for that night was false," he said bluntly. "Your roommates have now admitted that you didn't return to your apartment until after midnight. Not at 10:30 as you claimed. Where were you, Mr. Mitchell?" Brandon's composure faltered slightly, but his lawyer interjected before he could respond. "My client is not obligated to account for his whereabouts 3 decades ago, especially when he has not been charged with any crime. If you have evidence that Mr. Mitchell was involved in Ms. Hayes' disappearance, present it. Otherwise, this interview is over." Sullivan leaned across the table. "Here's what I think happened. I think Jennifer Hayes discovered information about sexual assaults and harassment at Dalhousie, including the assault you committed against Jessica Turner. I think she confronted you or threatened to expose you, and you arranged to meet her in the old science building to discuss it. Something went wrong during that meeting, and you killed her, either intentionally or accidentally. Then you disposed of her body, and used your connections with people like Peter Caldwell to make sure. The investigation never looked too closely at you." Brandon's face flushed with anger, but his lawyer's hand on his arm kept him from responding. The lawyer spoke instead. "That's a slanderous accusation based on pure speculation. You have no evidence, no witnesses, nothing but a false theory constructed from circumstantial details and testimony from people whose memories are unreliable after 3 decades. Unless you intend to charge my client, we're leaving." They stood up and walked out, leaving Sullivan alone in the conference room with the bitter taste of frustration. He had been so close to breaking Brandon, to forcing him to admit what he had done. But without physical evidence or a confession, the case remained unsolved. Detective Sullivan continued to work the Jennifer Hayes case for another 6 months, pursuing every lead, re-interviewing every witness, searching for the one piece of evidence that would finally provide answers. But as summer turned to fall in 2022, he was forced to admit that he had reached the same dead end that had stopped Detective Bennett 30 years earlier. The case remained cold, the mystery unsolved. The Halifax Regional Police held a press conference in October 2022, on the 32nd anniversary of Jennifer's disappearance, to announce the findings of the reinvestigation. Detective Sullivan stood at the podium and acknowledged that despite advances in forensic technology and new witness testimony, they had been unable to determine definitively what had happened to Jennifer Hayes. The case would remain open, and investigators would continue to follow any new leads that emerged. But after more than 3 decades, the likelihood of solving the mystery grew smaller with each passing year. In the audience at that press conference were David and Margaret Hayes' relatives, including Jennifer's cousin Emily Hayes, who had been only 7 years old when Jennifer disappeared, but who had grown up hearing stories about the cousin she had barely known. Emily, now a lawyer herself, had made it her mission to keep Jennifer's case in the public eye, to ensure that her cousin was not forgotten, and that the search for truth continued. Emily stood up during the question period following the press conference. "Detective Sullivan, you mentioned that you have identified persons of interest in this case but lack sufficient evidence to charge anyone. Can you tell us who those persons of interest are?" Sullivan hesitated, aware that he was treading into legally dangerous territory. "I can't name specific individuals without potentially exposing the department to lawsuits. What I can say is that we believe Jennifer's disappearance was connected to her investigation of misconduct at Dalhousie University, and that one or more individuals associated with the university had the means, motive, and opportunity to harm her. We continue to encourage anyone with information, no matter how insignificant it might seem, to come forward." The press conference generated a new round of media coverage, with journalists across Canada revisiting the Jennifer Hayes case and speculating about who the persons of interest might be. Brandon Mitchell Harrington's name appeared in several articles, though always carefully couched in language that stopped short of direct accusation. Brandon issued a statement through his lawyer denying any involvement in Jennifer's disappearance and threatening legal action against any media outlet that suggested otherwise. The publicity had an unexpected consequence. It prompted yet another witness to come forward, someone who had been carrying a secret for 32 years and who finally felt compelled to reveal what they knew. The witness was Anne Shepard, who had been a janitor at Dalhousie in 1990, working the night shift in various campus buildings. Anne had seen something on the night of October 23rd that had bothered her ever since, but she had been afraid to report it at the time because she was an undocumented immigrant from Poland and feared that coming forward would result in her deportation. Anne, now 73 years old and a Canadian citizen, contacted Detective Sullivan in November 2022. She explained that on the night Jennifer disappeared, she had been cleaning offices in the administration building when she had seen two people emerge from the entrance to the maintenance tunnels around 11:30 p.m. One was a young woman matching Jennifer's description, and the other was a man. They had been moving quickly, and the man had his hand on the woman's arm, guiding her or possibly restraining her. Anne had been too far away to hear what they were saying, but the woman had seemed resistant, pulling away from the man at one point before he pulled her back. "I knew something was wrong," Anne told Sullivan, her voice shaking with emotion. "But I was so afraid. I had 3 children, and we had come to Canada for a better life. If I reported what I saw, and the authorities found out I was here illegally, we would have been sent back to Poland. So I said nothing, and I have lived with that guilt every day since." "Can you describe the man you saw?" "He was tall, maybe 6 feet, with dark hair. Young, probably a student or maybe early 20s. He was wearing a jacket, I think a windbreaker or something similar. I'm sorry, it was dark, and I was quite far away. I didn't see his face clearly." "But you're certain it was a man, not a woman?" "Yes, definitely a man. His build, his height, the way he moved. It was a man." This testimony was significant because it corroborated the theory that Jennifer had been meeting someone in the maintenance tunnels or the old science building, and that she had been accompanied or perhaps forced to go with this person. The description Anne provided was generic enough that it could have fit Brandon Mitchell or any number of other young men on campus, but it was at least confirmation that Jennifer had not been alone when she disappeared. Sullivan showed Anne a series of photographs, including one of Brandon Mitchell from 1990. Anne studied them carefully, but couldn't make a positive identification. "It might have been him," she said, pointing to Brandon's photo. "The height and build are right, but I can't be certain. I'm sorry." Even without a positive identification, Anne's testimony gave Sullivan new leverage. He contacted Brandon's lawyer again and requested another interview, this time emphasizing that they now had a witness who had seen Jennifer with a man matching Brandon's description on the night she disappeared. He suggested that it would be in Brandon's best interest to provide a full account of his movements that evening, as continued evasion would only make him look more suspicious. To Sullivan's surprise, Brandon agreed to the interview, though once again with his lawyer present. They met in December 2022, this time at a neutral location, a police station in Halifax, in a formal interview room with cameras recording every word. Brandon sat across from Sullivan, looking tired and older than his 54 years. The decades of carrying his secret, if indeed he had one, seemed to have taken their toll. Sullivan began by presenting Anne Shepard's testimony, describing what she had seen in detail. Brandon listened without interruption, his face expressionless. When Sullivan finished, there was a long silence. Finally, Brandon spoke. "I want to tell you what really happened that night," he said quietly. "But I need immunity from prosecution, not just for anything related to Jennifer's disappearance, but for everything. Because what I'm about to tell you involves more than just one person's death. It involves corruption that went all the way to the top of the university administration." Sullivan and his superiors spent the next 2 weeks negotiating with Brandon's lawyer and with the Crown Prosecutor's office. The discussions were complicated and contentious, with prosecutors reluctant to grant immunity without knowing what information Brandon would provide. Eventually, a limited immunity agreement was reached. Brandon would be protected from prosecution for any role he played in covering up Jennifer's disappearance, but not for causing her death if he had been directly responsible for it. With the immunity agreement in place, Brandon returned to Halifax in January 2023 for a formal statement. What he revealed was more complex and disturbing than anyone had anticipated. Brandon began by admitting that he had lied about his alibi in 1990. He had not gone home after the student council meeting ended at 10 p.m. Instead, he had gone to the office of Dr. Gregory Morrison, the university's vice president of academic affairs, for a meeting that had been prearranged several days earlier. Dr. Morrison, who had died in 2018, had been deeply involved in the university's efforts to suppress harassment complaints and protect faculty members accused of misconduct. Dr. Morrison was worried about Jennifer Hayes, Brandon explained. She had been asking too many questions, talking to too many students, gathering information about complaints that the university had buried. Morrison knew that if she went public with what she had learned, it would be a disaster for Dalhousie's reputation and for his own career. He had worked for decades to build the university's prestige, and he wasn't going to let one idealistic undergraduate destroy it. "So what did Morrison want you to do?" "He wanted me to talk to Jennifer, to convince her to drop her investigation. He knew I was student council president, that I had credibility with other students. He thought Jennifer might listen to me if I framed it as concern for the university's well-being and for her own future. He even implied that if I could successfully persuade Jennifer to back off, he would help me get into law school and make sure I had good recommendation letters. And did you agree to this? Brandon nodded, shame evident on his face. I did. I was ambitious, and Morrison was offering me something I wanted. So I contacted Jennifer and told her I needed to talk to her about something important related to student council business. I suggested we meet in the old science building because it was quiet and private. She agreed, probably because she didn't suspect anything. She thought I was just another student, not someone working on behalf of the administration. What happened when you met her? We met around 10:30 in one of the basement rooms of the old science building. I tried to be subtle at first, talking about how the university was making efforts to improve its harassment policies, how change took time, how going public with complaints could harm innocent people and damage the institution's ability to attract good students and faculty. But Jennifer wasn't buying it. She was smart, and she saw right through me. She told me she knew I was there to shut her up, and she wasn't going to be silenced. Brandon paused, his hands trembling slightly. We argued. She accused me of being part of the problem, of caring more about protecting powerful men than about justice for victims. She even brought up Jessica Turner, the girl who had accused me of assault. Jennifer said she had talked to Jessica and knew what I had done, and that she was going to include it in the information she was planning to release. I panicked. Everything I had worked for, all my plans for law school and a political career, were about to be destroyed by this girl who wouldn't mind her own business. Sullivan felt his heartbeat accelerate. What did you do, Brandon? I grabbed her arm, trying to physically stop her from leaving. I told her she couldn't do this, that she didn't understand the consequences. She pulled away from me, and we struggled. She was screaming at me to let her go, telling me I was a monster. And then Brandon stopped, his face pale. His lawyer put a hand on his shoulder, but Brandon waved him away. I need to finish this. I've carried it for too long. What happened then? Sullivan prompted. Someone else was there. I hadn't realized it, but we weren't alone in the building. Whoever it was came up behind Jennifer while we were struggling. I saw a flash of movement, and then Jennifer suddenly went limp. At first I thought she had fainted, but then I saw blood on her head. Someone had hit her, hard. This revelation sent shockwaves through the interview room. Sullivan leaned forward urgently. Who was it? Who hit Jennifer? Peter Caldwell. He had followed me to the building, apparently on Morrison's orders, to make sure I successfully convinced Jennifer to back off. When he saw that I was failing, that Jennifer was going to go public no matter what, he took matters into his own hands. So, Peter Caldwell killed Jennifer Hayes? Yes, he hit her with something. I'm not sure what. A pipe or a piece of metal that was lying around in the building. She collapsed, and there was blood everywhere. I was in shock, couldn't believe what I was seeing. Caldwell checked her pulse and said she was dead. Then he looked at me and said, "This is what happens when people don't listen to reason. Now we need to clean this up, and you're going to help me." Brandon described how Caldwell had taken charge of the situation with frightening efficiency. They wrapped Jennifer's body in old tarps they found in the building and carried her through the maintenance tunnels to a service exit where Caldwell's car was parked. Caldwell drove them to a remote location outside Halifax, a construction site where a new development was being built. They buried Jennifer's body in a foundation pit that was scheduled to be filled with concrete the next day. Caldwell said no one would ever find her there, Brandon continued, his voice barely above a whisper. The concrete would be poured over her, and she would just disappear. He made me swear never to tell anyone what had happened. Said that if I ever spoke up, he would make sure I went down for murder. He had all the leverage. My fingerprints were in that room where Jennifer died. My DNA was probably on her from when we struggled. He could frame me completely if he wanted to, so I kept quiet. I lied to the police, got my roommates to lie for me, and I've lived with this nightmare for 32 years. Sullivan immediately dispatched teams to investigate the location Brandon had described. Construction records from 1990 were obtained, showing that the development Brandon mentioned had indeed been under construction at that time. Ground-penetrating radar was used to scan the area, and excavation was authorized for several promising locations. 4 days later, in a parking lot that had been built over the former construction site, excavation equipment uncovered human remains buried beneath several feet of concrete. Forensic anthropologists confirmed that the skeletal remains were consistent with a female aged approximately 18 to 25, and dental records confirmed what everyone already knew. The remains belonged to Jennifer Hayes. After 32 years, Jennifer had finally been found. She could be brought home to her family, or what remained of it. Emily Hayes, Jennifer's cousin, was notified of the discovery, and she arranged for Jennifer's remains to be laid to rest beside her parents in a cemetery in Dartmouth. A memorial service was held in February 2023, attended by hundreds of people including former classmates, university officials, investigators who had worked on the case over the years, and members of the public who had been touched by Jennifer's story. Peter Caldwell, the man Brandon Mitchell had identified as Jennifer's killer, had died in 2019, 3 years before the truth finally emerged. He would never face justice for his crime, but his role in Jennifer's death and in the broader culture of corruption at Dalhousie University was now public knowledge, and his reputation was permanently destroyed. Brandon Mitchell Harrington, despite the immunity agreement, faced significant consequences for his actions. His law license was suspended pending a disciplinary hearing, and several of his firm's major clients terminated their relationships with him. He was widely condemned in the media as someone who had chosen his own ambition over justice and who had enabled a killer to go free for more than 3 decades. His marriage ended, and he retreated from public life, living in relative seclusion in a small apartment in Ottawa. For Detective Marcus Sullivan, the resolution of the Jennifer Hayes case was bittersweet. He had solved one of Canada's most enduring mysteries, but the solution had come too late for Jennifer and her family. The people most responsible for her death were beyond the reach of justice, and the institutional rot that had created the conditions for her murder had persisted for years before being addressed. But the case did have a lasting impact on how universities across Canada handled allegations of sexual misconduct and harassment. Jennifer's death became a catalyst for reform, with new policies implemented requiring independent investigation of complaints, protection for whistleblowers, and transparency in disciplinary proceedings. Her story was taught in law schools and ethics classes as an example of what happens when institutions prioritize reputation over responsibility. Emily Hayes continued her crusade to honor her cousin's memory, establishing a scholarship fund in Jennifer's name for students pursuing studies in social justice and advocacy. She also became an outspoken critic of institutional corruption and a supporter of victims' rights, using her platform as a lawyer to push for stronger protections for those who speak up about wrongdoing. The old science building at Dalhousie University, where Jennifer's last moments had played out, was finally demolished in 2024, replaced by a modern facility dedicated to student services and mental health support. A plaque was installed at the entrance, commemorating Jennifer Hayes and acknowledging the university's failure to protect her. The inscription reads, "In memory of Jennifer Hayes, 1971-1990. Her courage in seeking truth and justice cost her everything. May we honor her by ensuring no student ever again pays such a price for doing what is right." Detective Sarah Bennett, now 80 years old and living in a care facility, was informed of the case's resolution. Though her health had declined significantly, her mind remained sharp enough to understand what had happened. When Detective Sullivan visited her to share the news, tears rolled down her weathered cheeks. "I always knew the university was protecting someone," she said quietly. "I just couldn't prove it. At least now Jennifer can rest, and people know what happened to her." "You laid the groundwork for solving this case," Sullivan told her. "All the work you did in 1990, all the evidence you collected. It was crucial to finally getting answers. Jennifer's family knows that you never gave up on her." The case officially closed in March 2023, more than 32 years after Jennifer Hayes walked out of her dormitory room on that October night and into a trap that would cost her her life. The Halifax Regional Police held a final press conference, announcing that Jennifer's death had been solved, and that responsibility lay with individuals who had acted to protect Dalhousie University's reputation at any cost, including the ultimate cost of a young woman's life. The story of Jennifer Hayes' disappearance and the decades-long search for truth became the subject of books, podcasts, documentaries, and academic studies. It stood as a cautionary tale about the dangers of institutional corruption, the vulnerability of those who challenge powerful systems, and the importance of never giving up the search for justice, no matter how long it takes. In Sheriff Hall at Dalhousie University, Room 314 still occasionally experiences strange occurrences, though perhaps they are less frequent now that Jennifer's remains have been found and laid to rest. Students who live there report feeling a presence sometimes, not threatening but watchful, as if someone is checking to make sure they are safe, that the dangers that once lurked in the shadows of the institution have been brought to light and addressed. On October 23rd of each year, students and faculty at Dalhousie gather for a memorial service honoring Jennifer Hayes and recommitting themselves to the values she died defending: transparency, accountability, justice, and the protection of those who speak up about wrongdoing. Her story has become part of the institution's history, a reminder of its darkest chapter, and a promise to do better. Emily Hayes continues to advocate for victims of institutional abuse, drawing on her cousin's story to illustrate why it is crucial that universities and other powerful organizations be held accountable when they fail to protect those in their care. She has successfully pushed for legislative changes in Nova Scotia, strengthening whistleblower protections and requiring independent oversight of harassment investigations at public institutions. The maintenance tunnels beneath Dalhousie University, where Jennifer made her final journey on that October night in 1990, have been extensively renovated and secured. No longer can students access them without authorization, and security cameras monitor all entrance points. The old Science Building's foundation, where Jennifer struggled with Brandon Mitchell before Peter Caldwell struck her down, has been excavated and removed entirely, replaced with a memorial garden where students can sit and reflect. For those who remember Jennifer Hayes personally, the resolution of her case brought a measure of peace, though the pain of her loss never fully faded. Amanda Cross and Bethany Sullivan, her friends who had lunch with her on her final day, attended the memorial service in 2023, both now middle-aged women with children of their own. They spoke about Jennifer's intelligence, her compassion, her determination to make the world better, and how those qualities had ultimately led to her death. She saw something wrong and couldn't let it go, Amanda said during the service. That's who Jennifer was. She couldn't walk past injustice and pretend she didn't see it. That courage is what got her killed, but it's also what we should remember and honor about her, because the world needs people like Jennifer, people who refuse to be silent when silence is easier. Rachel Morrison Chen, Jennifer's former roommate, also attended the service, traveling from British Columbia with her family. She had carried the guilt of that night for 3 decades, wondering if there was something she could have done differently, some way she could have prevented what happened. Learning that Jennifer had been deliberately lured to her death by people in positions of trust and authority didn't absolve Rachel of her guilt, but it helped her understand that there was nothing a 19-year-old roommate could have done to stop what had been set in motion by powerful forces within the university. I used to think that if I had just stayed in the room that night, if I hadn't gone to the library, maybe Jennifer would still be alive, Rachel said through tears during the memorial service. But now I understand that they would have found another way, another time. The system was designed to protect itself, and Jennifer was a threat to that system. What I can do now is make sure her sacrifice wasn't in vain, that the changes made because of her death are permanent and meaningful. The documentary team that had first brought renewed attention to Jennifer's case in 2020 produced a follow-up film in 2024 titled Justice for Jennifer: The Final Chapter. This second documentary traced the investigation from its 1990 origins through Brandon Mitchell's confession and the eventual discovery of Jennifer's remains. It became one of the most watched Canadian documentaries of the year, sparking national conversations about institutional accountability, the treatment of sexual assault victims, and the courage required to stand up to corrupt systems. The film ended with footage from Jennifer's reburial ceremony in February 2023, where Emily Hayes delivered a powerful eulogy that captured both the tragedy of her cousin's death and the hope represented by the reforms that followed. Standing before Jennifer's casket, surrounded by hundreds of mourners, Emily's voice rang clear and strong. Jennifer Hayes was murdered because she refused to be silent in the face of injustice, Emily said. She was 19 years old, a psychology student with dreams of helping others, and she discovered that the institution she trusted was protecting predators instead of students. When she tried to expose that truth, powerful men decided she had to be eliminated. They killed her, buried her beneath concrete, and thought they could make her disappear forever. Emily paused, looking out at the crowd. But Jennifer didn't disappear. Her absence was felt every day by everyone who loved her. Her case became a symbol of everything wrong with how institutions handle misconduct. And ultimately, the truth she died trying to reveal came to light anyway, just 32 years too late. Today, we lay Jennifer's body to rest, but we must never let her story rest. We must continue the work she started, holding powerful institutions accountable and protecting those who dare to speak truth to power. The crowd stood in silence as Jennifer's casket was lowered into the ground beside her parents' graves. A cold wind blew in from the Atlantic, carrying with it the scent of salt and the promise of spring after a long winter. As mourners filed past the grave, many placed flowers or small tokens of remembrance. Students from Dalhousie left notes expressing gratitude for Jennifer's sacrifice and promising to continue fighting for justice on campus. Survivors of sexual assault left messages of solidarity, telling Jennifer that her courage had inspired them to come forward with their own stories. In the weeks following the reburial, memorials to Jennifer appeared across Canada. Universities held vigils and discussions about campus safety and institutional accountability. The Canadian government announced new funding for independent oversight of harassment investigations at publicly funded institutions. Several provinces passed legislation strengthening whistleblower protections and requiring universities to report misconduct allegations to external authorities. At Dalhousie University, the changes were most dramatic. The entire administration was restructured, with new leadership committed to transparency and student safety. A survivor support center was established, funded by a multi-million-dollar donation from an anonymous benefactor later revealed to be one of the university's wealthiest alumni, who had been moved by Jennifer's story to demand better from his alma mater. The center provided counseling, legal advocacy, and support services to students who experienced harassment or assault, ensuring that no one would face their trauma alone or without resources. The psychology department, where Jennifer had studied, established an annual lecture series in her name, bringing prominent speakers to campus to discuss ethics, institutional accountability, and the psychology of corruption. The first lecture was delivered by Dr. Philip Zimbardo, famous for the Stanford prison experiment, who spoke about how good institutions can become corrupted and how individual courage is necessary to resist systemic wrongdoing. Detective Marcus Sullivan continued working for the Halifax Regional Police until his retirement in 2028. The Jennifer Hayes case remained the defining achievement of his career, though he always maintained that the real credit belonged to Detective Sarah Bennett, who had done the foundational work 3 decades earlier. Sullivan visited Bennett regularly in her care facility until her death in 2025 at age 82. At her funeral, he delivered a eulogy praising her dedication and integrity, noting that she had never given up on Jennifer even when the case seemed hopeless. Brandon Mitchell Harrington's life after his confession was one of isolation and regret. He lost his law license permanently, his marriage ended in divorce, and his adult children refused to speak to him after learning what he had done. He lived on savings and investments in a small apartment in a suburb of Ottawa, rarely venturing out except for necessities. In 2026, he published a memoir titled The Weight of Silence, in which he detailed his role in covering up Jennifer's death and expressed remorse for his actions. The book received mixed reviews, with some praising his honesty while others condemned it as an attempt to profit from a tragedy he had helped cause. All proceeds from the book were donated to the Jennifer Hayes Memorial Scholarship Fund, which by 2028 had grown to over $2 million and had supported more than 50 students pursuing degrees in fields related to social justice, advocacy, and institutional reform. Recipients of the scholarship were required to complete a project related to fighting corruption or supporting survivors of abuse, ensuring that Jennifer's legacy of activism continued through each new generation. The location where Jennifer's body had been found became a place of quiet pilgrimage for those touched by her story. Though it was just a parking lot on the outskirts of Halifax, people would occasionally park their cars and stand in silent reflection, thinking about the young woman who had been buried there for so long. In 2027, the property owner agreed to allow a small memorial marker to be placed at the site, a simple stone plaque reading, "Here Jennifer Hayes was found after 32 years. May all who pass remember that truth, though buried, will eventually come to light." The maintenance tunnels beneath Dalhousie University, once the route of Jennifer's final journey, were transformed into a different kind of passage. The university commissioned a series of murals along the tunnel walls, created by students and local artists, depicting themes of courage, truth, and the fight against injustice. One mural showed a young woman with auburn hair, holding a light in the darkness, illuminating hidden corners where shadows tried to hide. The mural bore no caption, but everyone who saw it knew who it represented. On October 23, 2030, 40 years after Jennifer Hayes walked out of her dormitory room and disappeared into the night, Dalhousie University dedicated a new building in her honor, the the Jennifer Hayes Center for Ethics and Institutional Accountability. The building housed offices for researchers studying organizational behavior and corruption, classrooms where courses on ethics and social justice were taught, and a museum documenting Jennifer's case and the broader history of institutional failures in protecting vulnerable populations. Emily Hayes, now in her 40s and a prominent advocate for victims' rights, spoke at the dedication ceremony. She stood before a bronze statue of Jennifer that had been placed in the building's atrium, showing her cousin as she had been in life. Young, determined, holding books in her arms and looking forward with hope and purpose. For 40 years we have lived with the shadow of what happened to Jennifer, Emily said. But shadows can only exist where there is light, and Jennifer herself was that light. She saw clearly when others chose blindness. She spoke truth when others chose silence. She acted with courage when others chose compliance. That light was snuffed out by those who feared what it might reveal. But it could never be truly extinguished. Emily gestured to the building around them. This center exists because Jennifer's light continues to shine through all of us, who refuse to accept that institutions are more important than the people they serve, who refuse to stay silent when we witness injustice, who refuse to let power hide behind reputation and tradition. Every student who studies here, every researcher who works here, every person who passes through these doors will be walking in Jennifer's footsteps, continuing the work she began and died for. The crowd applauded, and as the ceremony concluded, attendees filed through the museum, seeing photographs of Jennifer's life, reading about her case, and learning about the systemic changes that had resulted from her death. Many visitors were students who had not even been born when Jennifer disappeared, but who now understood that their safe campus environment existed because a young woman their own age had refused to look away from evil and had paid the ultimate price. In room 314 of Sheriff Hall, now preserved as a memorial space that students could visit, Jennifer's desk remained as it had been on that October night in 1990. Textbooks open, a cold cup of tea, an unfinished essay. A plaque on the door explained the significance of the room and invited visitors to reflect on the importance of institutional accountability and the courage required to challenge corrupt systems. Many students reported feeling a sense of peace in the room, as if Jennifer herself approved of how her story had been used to protect others. The case of Jennifer Hayes officially closed in 2023, but her story continued to resonate far beyond the legal resolution. It became a touchstone in discussions about campus safety, institutional corruption, and the treatment of whistleblowers. Law schools used it as a case study in ethics courses. Psychology programs examined it through the lens of organizational behavior and moral courage. Journalism schools taught it as an example of how investigative reporting can bring truth to light, even when official channels fail. For those who had known Jennifer personally, time slowly eased the sharpest edges of grief, though it never fully healed. Amanda Cross and Bethany Sullivan remained close friends throughout their lives, bound together by their shared memory of Jennifer and their determination to honor her legacy. Both became advocates for student safety and worked with universities across Canada to improve their harassment reporting systems. Rachel Morrison Chen found peace through therapy and through her work establishing support groups for people who had been traumatized by the violent loss of someone close to them. She often spoke about how Jennifer's case had shaped her understanding of institutional responsibility and personal courage, and how the grief she carried had motivated her to help others navigate their own traumatic experiences. Detective Sarah Bennett's funeral in 2025 was attended by dozens of people whose cases she had worked over her long career, including several who had been children when they went missing and whom she had helped reunite with their families. Emily Hayes spoke at the service, thanking Bennett for never giving up on Jennifer and for laying the groundwork that eventually led to solving the case. Detective Bennett showed us that justice delayed is still justice, and that no case is ever truly cold as long as someone refuses to let it freeze, Emily said. As the years passed and the initial shock of the case's resolution faded into history, Jennifer Hayes' story took on the quality of legend. Students at Dalhousie spoke of her in hushed tones, passing down stories to new arrivals about the girl who had disappeared and the corruption she had died exposing. Her name became synonymous with moral courage and the price sometimes paid for doing what is right. On autumn evenings when the wind howls through Halifax's streets as it did on that October night in 1990, students walking across Dalhousie's campus sometimes pause at the memorial plaque outside Sheriff Hall and read Jennifer's name. Some say a quiet prayer, others simply stand in silence, acknowledging the debt they owe to a young woman they never knew, but whose sacrifice made their campus safer. The mystery of Jennifer Hayes' disappearance, unsolved for 32 years, became a solved case with a clear resolution. She was murdered by Peter Caldwell to protect institutional corruption, with Brandon Mitchell's complicity and the broader university administration's enabling. But the larger mystery, the one that continues to haunt those who study her case, is why institutions so often choose reputation over truth, protection of the powerful over protection of the vulnerable, and silence over justice. That question has no easy answer. But Jennifer's story provides a roadmap for those seeking change. Speak truth, refuse silence, document corruption, and trust that even if justice is delayed, even if you don't live to see the results of your courage, the truth will eventually emerge. Seeds planted in darkness will someday break through into light. The autumn wind still carries echoes through Halifax, whispers of that October night when everything changed. But now those whispers include not just the mystery and the tragedy, but also the resolution and the reforms, the pain and the progress, the death and the enduring life of Jennifer Hayes' legacy. She vanished from her dormitory room in 1990, but she was found in 2023, and in the finding, thousands more were protected from experiencing similar fates. Jennifer Hayes was 19 years old when she died. She had been a psychology student with dreams of helping others, a daughter beloved by her parents, a friend treasured by those who knew her, and a young woman with the moral courage to stand against injustice, even when it cost her everything. Her life was cut short, but her impact continues to ripple outward, touching people and institutions she never met and will never know. In the end, the case of the student who vanished in 1990 was not just about a campus mystery unsolved for 3 decades. It was about the corruption that made her disappearance possible, the courage that makes such disappearances necessary for those trying to hide truth, the persistence required to finally uncover what happened, and the changes implemented to ensure it never happens again. It was about Jennifer Hayes, who refused to be complicit in evil and paid with her life, but whose death ultimately accomplished what her life had sought: exposing corruption, protecting victims, and holding powerful institutions accountable. The books Jennifer left open on her desk that October night remain open in the memorial room, symbolic of a life interrupted, but also of work that continues. The essay she was writing, about the psychological impact of institutional betrayal on victims of abuse, was eventually completed by psychology professors at Dalhousie, using her notes and research. It was published in an academic journal in her name, ensuring that her voice, silenced for so long, finally spoke the truths she had died trying to reveal. Today, when students at Dalhousie University face difficult decisions about whether to report misconduct, whether to challenge authority, whether to speak truth at personal cost, many think of Jennifer Hayes. Her statue stands in the building that bears her name. Her plaque marks the place she disappeared. Her story echoes through classrooms and dormitories. And in thinking of her, many find the courage to do what she did: choose truth over safety, justice over silence, integrity over convenience. This is Jennifer Hayes' legacy, and it is a legacy that will endure as long as institutions exist that need to be held accountable, as long as individuals face choices between complicity and courage, as long as young people ask themselves what kind of person they want to be and what kind of world they want to live in. Her disappearance in 1990 was a tragedy, but her rediscovery in 2023 became something more. A reminder that truth cannot be buried forever, that justice may be delayed but need not be denied, and that one person's courage, even if it costs them everything, can change the world for countless others. The student who vanished in 1990 was found. The campus mystery was solved. And in the solving, Jennifer Hayes finally came home, not just to the grave where her body rests beside her parents, but to the hearts of all who heard her story and chose to continue the fight she began. The mystery is no longer unsolved, but Jennifer's work continues, carried forward by everyone who refuses to let injustice hide in shadows, who demands accountability from those in power, and who believes that no institution's reputation is worth more than a single person's life.